John Denver wasn't just a music legend. He was a pilot, a dreamer, and a man chasing peace in the sky. But on October 12, 1997, his final flight ended in a violent crash that stunned the world. What really happened that day wasn't just tragic. It was preventable. The autopsy revealed more than cause of death. It uncovered ignored warnings, deadly design flaws, and a chilling truth the public never fully knew. Denver didn't die from recklessness. He died because no one stopped what was clearly broken. This is the terrifying truth, hidden behind one of music's most haunting endings. The fatal flight and immediate crash site facts. On the afternoon of October 12, 1997, John Denver stepped into the cockpit of his newly purchased experimental aircraft, a Rutan Long-EZ. He took off from the Monterey Peninsula Airport around 5:28 p.m. for what was supposed to be a short flight, a routine set of practice takeoffs and landings. But within minutes, something went wrong. Witnesses reported hearing the engine sputter, then go completely silent. Moments later, they saw the plane drop nose first into the Pacific Ocean. The crash was fast, violent, and final. John Denver had only flown that aircraft once before, and briefly. He had purchased it just a day earlier and had logged less than 30 minutes of time in it, accompanied by the previous owner. The plane was tricky. It was light, fast, and unusually designed. When he took it up alone that Sunday, Denver had little practical experience handling its controls. He barely knew how that plane responded, one investigator later said. Still, he felt confident enough to take off without any additional training. The crash was witnessed by several boaters and beachgoers along the Pacific Grove shoreline. They described the aircraft falling at a steep angle before slamming into the water and exploding on impact. One person said it looked like the plane just gave out mid-air and dropped like a rock. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Denver's body was found still strapped into the wreckage, floating among debris. He was declared dead at the scene. No distress call had ever been made. But even as the wreckage was pulled from the sea, there were questions. Why did a seasoned pilot like John Denver crash while flying in clear weather? What happened inside that cockpit in the final seconds? The answers wouldn't come from the crash site. They'd come from the autopsy table, the flight log, and the cockpit layout. Because what looked like a simple accident turned out to be far more complicated and far more avoidable. John Denver's crash made headlines within hours, but something about the story felt off. The early reports focused on reckless flying or poor judgment, but they didn't match what the investigators were starting to uncover. The facts from the autopsy, the aircraft design, and the fuel system told a much different story, one the public didn't hear until much later. Autopsy confirms instant death, not suicide. The autopsy report left no room for doubt. John Denver died instantly from blunt force trauma to the head and chest. The violent impact of the crash was enough to cause massive internal injuries. According to the coroner, there was no suffering. He died the moment of impact. It was a sudden, catastrophic end, one that left no chance of survival. This finding immediately ruled out theories of a long struggle or in-flight distress. More importantly, toxicology results showed zero signs of alcohol or drugs. For a man who had once battled substance abuse, that result mattered. He was clean, completely, said the coroner. Earlier media reports had hinted at possible intoxication, but those rumors were put to rest. The tests were thorough and conclusive. Denver had not been impaired when he took off that day. He was fully alert and focused. Denver wasn't wearing a seatbelt, But this wasn't carelessness. The aircraft's cockpit design made it difficult for the pilot to wear one while still accessing the fuel selector valve, located behind the seat. Investigators confirmed that wearing the belt would have made it almost impossible for him to switch tanks mid-flight. It was a cruel design flaw. In order to fly safely, he had to choose between safety restraints or fuel access. What worried officials most was what the autopsy said about Denver's final moments. His injuries suggested he had twisted his body just before the plane nosedived. This aligned with the theory that he had tried to reach behind his left shoulder to access the fuel valve. He was doing everything he could to recover control, one NTSB official said. He didn't give up. He fought to save the aircraft. But the cockpit setup was stacked against him. Denver's autopsy report made something clear. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't impaired. What brought the plane down wasn't drugs, recklessness, or a death wish. It was something far more mechanical. Investigators turned their focus to the aircraft itself, especially one strange design feature that made it nearly impossible to fly safely when things went wrong. Fuel starvation was the primary cause. At the heart of the crash was fuel starvation. Denver's plane didn't crash because of a faulty engine. It crashed because the engine ran out of fuel mid-flight. He had been flying on the left fuel tank, which emptied during a series of practice takeoffs and landings. Instead of switching tanks easily, he had to reach behind his left shoulder and manually rotate a valve using pliers, a design flaw that proved fatal. The aircraft had 2 fuel tanks, but the selector valve wasn't just hard to reach, it was poorly labeled and stiff. Investigators said the valve was not only in an awkward position, but also required tools to turn during flight. That meant Denver had to lean backward, rotate the valve without seeing it, and hope he chose the right tank. It was like asking someone to drive with one hand while reaching behind them with the other, one FAA official stated. What made it worse was the fuel gauge system. The indicators were placed behind the pilot and offered nonlinear, vague readings. Denver needed a handheld mirror just to check fuel levels. Even then, the gauges didn't show exact numbers, just rough estimates. A reading of 1/4 full might mean 5 gallons, or 2. There was no reliable way to track usage while flying, and Denver likely believed he had more fuel than he did. By the time he realized the engine had failed, he had just seconds to act. He tried to switch tanks, but when he twisted around and reached back, his foot likely pressed the right rudder pedal, sending the aircraft into an uncontrolled descent. It wasn't pilot error, it was a cockpit setup that didn't give the pilot a chance. This was a crash waiting to happen, said the NTSB report. And it finally did. Design flaws made the plane unflyable in crisis. The Rutan Long EZ wasn't built like other planes. Its fuel selector valve was positioned in an extremely dangerous spot, behind the pilot's left shoulder. That meant to switch fuel tanks mid-air, the pilot had to twist around blindly while keeping the plane steady. Denver had voiced concerns about the placement just days before the crash. "This thing's built to kill someone," he reportedly told a friend. But no one took action to fix it in time. Reaching that selector was more than just awkward. It required strength and tools. In Denver's plane, the valve was so tight it needed pliers to turn. Imagine flying at 5,000 feet, running low on fuel, and having to grab pliers, reach over your shoulder, and blindly rotate a stiff valve without seeing it. Investigators later confirmed he would have had to let go of the controls to operate it. That one flaw made safe flying impossible during an emergency. Another overlooked issue was the fuel gauge placement. The indicators were mounted behind the pilot, making them unreadable during flight without using a handheld mirror. Even when Denver used the mirror, the gauges didn't offer precise readings. A quarter tank might not mean what it looked like. The margin of error could be fatal. In fact, the NTSB found the fuel level readings were often misinterpreted even by trained pilots. Denver had no chance of making accurate decisions under those conditions. Combined, these design problems created a lethal trap. The cockpit required unnatural body movements to perform basic actions, and the control layout violated several principles of flight safety. Denver wasn't just flying a poorly designed aircraft. He was flying a plane that defied logic under stress. The setup would be hard for a young, fit pilot in perfect weather, said one aviation expert. For John, in that moment, it was a death sentence. As investigators looked deeper, they found the real issue wasn't just the bad design, it was how the plane had been allowed to fly in that condition at all. John Denver wasn't flying a commercial aircraft. He was flying a home-built experimental model, one that didn't follow the same FAA safety standards. And that legal gap is what truly opened the door to disaster. Experimental aircraft exempt from key safety rules. John Denver's Long EZ was legally classified as an experimental amateur-built aircraft. That classification changes everything. Planes like his don't need to meet the same FAA certification standards as commercial planes. Builders can install parts, modify layouts, and even change flight controls without standard inspections. In Denver's case, the aircraft had been customized in multiple ways that were never formally evaluated for safety. The fuel system itself had been moved and altered by a previous owner. The selector valve wasn't in its original position, and that meant the pilot had no reference materials or prior experience with that exact layout. The FAA didn't require an inspection of these changes before Denver took flight. That valve was not designed by engineers, it was adjusted by hobbyists, one official later stated. The difference between a minor tweak and a fatal flaw is often just a few inches. Denver also wasn't trained or certified in this particular model. While he was a licensed pilot overall, he hadn't logged enough time in experimental aircraft, especially one as specific and tricky as the Rutan Long EZ. The FAA didn't require additional training. There was no test flight, no second pilot, no instructor, just a short run-up with the seller. And then Denver was on his own. That lack of oversight was deadly. Finally, because the plane was considered privately built, it wasn't subject to strict airworthiness checks before flight. There was no requirement for a certified mechanic to approve it, and no pre-flight safety inspection by officials. That meant dangerous configurations could go unnoticed until it was too late. This wasn't just pilot error, said the NTSB report. It was a structural system failure, one that cost John Denver his life. But there was one more layer to this story, one that turned the spotlight back on John himself. As the facts unraveled, investigators discovered Denver should never have been flying at all that day. Not because of his skills, but because his license had already been pulled. And what they found next revealed a troubling pattern that had started long before the crash. Denver was not licensed to fly that plane. At the time of the crash, John Denver wasn't legally allowed to fly. His medical certificate, which was required to keep his pilot's license valid, had been suspended by the FAA. The reason? 2 separate DUI arrests in the 1990s. Under FAA rules, a pilot must show sobriety and complete medical evaluations before their license is renewed. Denver never finished that process. He simply kept flying anyway. The FAA had sent multiple certified letters asking him to respond and comply with the suspension process. Denver refused to accept them. For months, he sidestepped the paperwork, creating a legal loophole. Because he hadn't signed for the letters, the revocation couldn't go through officially. It wasn't until March 1997 7 months before the crash, that he finally signed for one. That single act officially grounded him. Still, that didn't stop him. On October 12th, he took off anyway, without a valid medical certificate, in a plane he wasn't trained to fly, and in clear violation of FAA rules. Investigators found no evidence that he had completed a sobriety program or reapplied for his license. He just ignored the system, one aviation analyst said. And the system wasn't built to stop someone who wouldn't cooperate. Denver's own past added more red flags. He had crashed before. In 1989, he damaged another aircraft during a poor landing attempt. He had a love for flying, but also a history of taking risks, bending rules, and going up solo when others advised against it. Friends had warned him. Mechanics had warned him. Even his own record warned him. But none of it was enough to keep him grounded when it mattered most. FAA loophole allowed him to keep flying. The reason John Denver was in the sky that day wasn't because he was cleared. It was because he found a way around the system. After 2 DUI arrests, the FAA suspended his medical certificate, which made his pilot's license invalid. But instead of fixing the issue, Denver used a technical loophole. He refused to accept the certified letters sent to him by the FAA. No signature meant no official delivery, and no enforcement. This legal gray area let him fly illegally for months. Denver returned every letter unopened. He knew the rules, but he also knew that unless the FAA had confirmation he received the notice, they couldn't complete the revocation process. By avoiding the paperwork, he bought time. The system relies on honesty, one investigator said. If a pilot plays the paperwork, they can slip through. That's exactly what Denver did, until March 1997, when he finally signed for one of the letters. The moment he signed, the rules changed. His license was formally revoked, and flying after that became a federal violation. From March until the crash in October, he was officially grounded. But Denver didn't reapply. He didn't seek medical clearance. He didn't complete any rehab. He simply ignored the restriction and kept flying. On the day of the crash, he had no valid certification, no current training, and no legal clearance to be in the air. That day, when he got into the Rutan Long EZ, he broke multiple federal aviation laws. He wasn't just flying a dangerous aircraft. He was doing so with no legal right to be at the controls. The FAA called the case an unfortunate example of system limitations. It wasn't that they didn't act. It's that the system gave him too many chances to keep flying, even after they had tried to stop him. When the news broke about John Denver's death, it didn't take long for speculation to begin. Some said it was reckless. Others whispered something darker. There were rumors, unfounded but persistent, that Denver had crashed on purpose. The media latched onto them. But the evidence, when laid out clearly, pointed in a very different direction. The suicide rumors that wouldn't die. Almost immediately after the crash, whispers of suicide began to circulate. Denver had been through 2 divorces, lost his contract with RCA, and watched his career decline from the heights of his 1970s fame. Some tabloids jumped to conclusions. They pointed to his struggles with addiction, his isolation, and his bitter public disputes. One headline even read, "Did John give up on life?" But when the NTSB reviewed the crash, the suicide theory didn't hold. The evidence inside the cockpit and flight log showed something else. Denver had attempted to switch fuel tanks, not simply ride the plane into the water. His physical movements, twisting back, reaching left, showed active attempts to save the flight. Everything he did was consistent with a pilot trying to regain control, said the report. That one sentence crushed the suicide claim. More than that, Denver's behavior in the days before the crash didn't match someone planning to die. He had just recorded new music, including demos for an album he hoped to release in 1998. He'd been in good spirits, according to friends, even talking about future performances. One confidant said, "He was the most hopeful I'd seen him in years." That kind of mindset doesn't fit the suicide profile painted by sensational outlets. Despite these facts, the rumors never fully went away. Some fans couldn't accept that their hero died from a mechanical issue and bad decisions. Conspiracies were easier to swallow than reality. But the truth was in the black and white reports. John Denver was not trying to die. He was trying to fly. The plane and the system failed him first. For a man who spent his life chasing the sky, John Denver's final moments were heartbreakingly quiet. There was no mayday, no dramatic explosion, just static and silence. But hidden in that silence were the last words he ever spoke, and the confirmation that he fought until the very end. Final cockpit communication revealed critical seconds. There was no black box on John Denver's aircraft. Most small, experimental planes didn't have one. But there were radio communications with local air traffic control, and those recordings told the story. As the engine failed and the plane began to fall, Denver's voice came through, steady but serious. "I'm out of fuel." It was short, calm, and final. Then the signal cut out. There were no distress calls, no panicked shouting. Witnesses on the ground reported hearing the engine sputter and go silent. Several said they saw the plane wobble, then nosedive. But Denver never lost his cool on the radio. His last words were measured. One NTSB officer noted he was trying to handle it. That tone, controlled and focused, matched what the autopsy and cockpit analysis later revealed. The communications, while brief, also disproved claims that the crash was staged or suicidal. Denver didn't speak like a man giving up. He spoke like a pilot trying to stay airborne. The message, "I'm out of fuel," wasn't just a declaration, it was a diagnosis. He knew the cause of the problem. What he didn't have was time to fix it. In those final moments, Denver was alone in the sky with a failing engine, a flawed plane, and a body twisted in a cockpit that gave him no options. But he still tried. He made the call. He reached for the valve. He did what any good pilot would. The tragedy wasn't in how he reacted. It was in how little help the aircraft gave him to survive. A life that always came back to the sky. Flying wasn't just a hobby for John Denver, it was his lifelong obsession. His father, Captain Henry Dutch Deutschendorf, was a decorated Air Force pilot who set multiple speed records. Growing up around planes, John saw the sky as a place of escape and connection. Flying made him feel close to his father, a friend once said. That emotional bond with flight never left him, and eventually, it cost him everything. Denver earned several aviation ratings, including 4 gliders, jets, and multi-engine aircraft. He logged more than 2,700 hours of flying time over the years. But he also had a reputation for flying experimental and risky aircraft. While he followed regulations early in his career, he became more defiant over time, ignoring restrictions and flying solo without training. He didn't want limits, a former mechanic recalled. He thought he could handle anything. His love for flying showed up constantly in his music. Songs like "Flying for Me," "Eagles and Horses," and "Wind Song" captured the emotional connection he had with the air. His lyrics often reflected peace, solitude, and transcendence. All feelings he found in the cockpit. Even Rocky Mountain High and leaving on a jet plane carried undertones of that skyward longing. But the beauty of it masked a danger he refused to acknowledge. In the end, that connection to flight became a curse. Denver knew his license was invalid. He knew the aircraft was unfamiliar, and he knew the design flaws were serious. But flying still called to him, emotionally, spiritually, and dangerously. The sky gave him peace, one pilot friend said. But peace doesn't always mean safety. In that cockpit, he wasn't just chasing air. He was chasing something he could never quite land. Denver's final flight wasn't just a tragedy of one man's passion, it was a failure shared by others. Warnings were given, concerns were raised, but nobody stepped in. When investigators looked back, they found a trail of missed chances, quiet voices that tried to speak up before it was too late, the hidden warnings. Nobody took seriously. Before the crash, multiple people tried to intervene. One mechanic in California warned Denver about the fuel valve position, calling it a design flaw that could kill. Another acquaintance told him the plane needed at least 10 hours of training flights before going solo. But these concerns weren't enforced, only suggested. And Denver didn't listen. He said he'd be fine, one person recalled. He wasn't. The NTSB investigation later confirmed that several people, including flight instructors and aircraft builders, were aware of the aircraft's quirks. But because it was privately built, there was no official requirement to file safety reports or halt usage. FAA rules gave builders freedom, but that freedom meant there was no one with the authority to stop Denver from flying. The system trusted the pilot to know better, the report said. And sometimes, they don't. Denver's friends had also noticed his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the crash. He had become increasingly isolated, drank occasionally despite his DUI record, and sometimes refused to answer calls for days. His autobiography, released in 1994, had already exposed a darker side: violence, addiction, mood swings. But few expected that turbulence to cross into his flying. He seemed okay on the outside, one friend said, but that plane became a blind spot. The investigation revealed a chilling truth. Almost everything that led to the crash had been known or warned about. The cockpit layout, the fuel system, the FAA violations, it was all out in the open. But without a structure to intervene, it didn't matter. The red flags were waving, said one safety officer, but there was no one assigned to grab them. The tragedy sparked outrage, but also something more lasting: reform. After John Denver's death, the FAA and the aviation community were forced to confront a truth they had avoided for years. If someone that famous could fall through the cracks, who else could be next? How the crash changed aviation rules. John Denver's crash led to real policy changes. The FAA revised its guidance on experimental aircraft, especially around cockpit ergonomics. The fuel selector valve issue became a top concern, with new emphasis on in-flight accessibility and safety during emergency procedures. Planes with similar setups were flagged, and new kits came with stricter build instructions. The FAA also began encouraging better pilot transition training, especially when switching between aircraft types. In Denver's case, he had only flown the Long EZ for about 30 minutes before going solo. That wasn't illegal, but it was now recognized as a risk. The FAA began issuing formal advisories for experimental aircraft purchases, recommending supervised test flights before independent use. One of the biggest impacts came from public pressure. Denver's death drew national attention. News outlets, pilot forums, and aviation experts began pushing for reform. The story of a beloved public figure crashing a legally flawed plane forced the FAA to reevaluate its stance on amateur-built aircraft. This wasn't a celebrity crash, one flight analyst said. It was a systems failure we all had to face. In the years that followed, flight schools updated their risk education programs, insurance providers raised premiums on experimental craft, and pilot associations began lobbying for more transparency in build records. John Denver's name became part of aviation safety courses, not as a cautionary tale of ego, but of oversight failure. His final act reshaped how thousands of pilots approached personal flight. By the time the final report was released, the facts were undeniable. This wasn't a tragic mystery. It was a story with causes, clear, documented, and deeply preventable. But John Denver's death wasn't just a case file. It was a message, one that still echoes every time a pilot straps into a cockpit alone. A voice silenced, but a warning echoed. John Denver was more than a singer. He was a symbol of peace, nature, and wonder, someone whose songs spoke of hope, healing, and flight. But his autopsy, cold and clinical, told a harsher truth. He didn't die from recklessness. He died from being unprotected, from a plane that betrayed him and a system that let it happen. His voice is gone, one fan wrote, but his silence screams. The final NTSB report stated that the crash was due to pilot unfamiliarity, poor design, and systemic failure in safety oversight. Those words didn't just apply to Denver. They applied to every pilot who flies in aircraft without modern safety checks, and to every agency that chooses trust over structure. His name became a symbol, not just of what he sang, but of what he warned. Even today, pilots remember. The fuel selector valve is now often used as an example of why cockpit design matters. Experimental aircraft builders now read disclaimers that never existed in 1997. Flight instructors point to Denver's case as a reminder that even the most skilled, most passionate aviators must follow the rules and must demand safer systems. In the end, John Denver's greatest gift wasn't just his music. It was what came after. His death forced the world to look harder, to fix what had gone unchecked, and to realize that legends fall not because they fail, but because they're not protected. The sky he loved took him, but the legacy he left behind still grounds us all. John Denver gave the world songs that felt like home, warm, honest, and full of life. But his death was something else entirely. It wasn't just a plane crash. It was a warning ignored. A system failed, and a man, beloved by millions, left to fly alone in a cockpit that was never safe to begin with. The autopsy didn't just confirm how he died. It exposed why. A dangerous aircraft, a revoked license, a fuel system so flawed it turned a moment of panic into a death sentence. But beyond the wreckage and reports, there's something deeper. Denver's death showed us that even legends can be failed by the very systems meant to protect them. It revealed how oversight gaps and quiet warnings can lead to irreversible tragedy. And it proved that passion, even the kind that lifts us, can blind us to danger. Today, his voice still echoes in the mountains, in the sky, and in the hearts of those he left behind. But so does his final flight, a silent lesson written in black box reports and broken wings. John Denver died chasing the freedom he always sang about. But his story now stands as a haunting reminder of what happens when no one says stop.